everybody. My name is Volker Roelcke from the University of Gießen in Germany. And I was invited by Professor Winja to talk about international and German medicine after the war, post-war apologies of medical organizations, and legacies for clinical ethics. It's actually three big issues, and I will try to condense them in one rather short presentation. So let me start, next slide please. Let me start with the Nuremberg medical trial. You may have heard about this already in one of the previous sessions. These were criminal proceedings of an American military tribunal, which started in December 1946 and were concluded in August 1947. It was the first of the 12 subsequent trials after the initial international military tribunal at Nuremberg against 24 defendants of the political, economic, and military Nazi leadership, like Hermann Göring or Alfred Rosenberg. So there was this first main international trial, and then there was a subsequent, there were 12 further trials against specific kinds of potential or likely perpetrators. And the first of these subsequent trials was the one against medics, physicians and medical administrators. So there were altogether 23 defendants. 20 of them were German physicians chosen from all ranks of the medical hierarchy in an exemplary way, and 3 high-rank medical administrators. The indictment was willing participation in war crimes and crimes against humanity, and as the opening statement by Telford Taylor said more specifically, there was the charge of murders, tortures, and other atrocities committed in the name of medical science. So this was a criminal trial, but it was, quote, no mere murder trial, as Telford Taylor, the chief counsel of the prosecution, said in the opening statement. It was no mere murder trial, which implied that to adequately evaluate the activities of the defendants required not only legal expertise, but also an additional and distinctive scientific and ethical dimension. So therefore, there was an important role for medical expert witnesses at the trial, like the neurologist Leo Alexander, the physiologist Andrew Ivy, both Americans, and also the German psychiatrist and medical historian Werner Leifband, who were all, as I said, medical expert witnesses at the trial. And in the course of the trial, it became obvious that the German physicians involved in the medical atrocities were not simply fringe figures in the medical community of the time, or maybe fanatic psychopaths. That is quite a kind of stereotype which many hold today, but it was also already obvious at the trial itself that, for instance, 12 of the 20 medical defendants were members of the prestigious medical schools of the universities of Berlin, Vienna, or Munich. So they were not fringe guys. So these German medical schools had been the model actually in the preceding years or decades of the 20th century. They had been the model for US medical schools, like Johns Hopkins University Medical School was directly modeled from the Berlin and Heidelberg University Medical School. These university medical schools were also considered internationally as centers of excellence. So many young physicians went there to get their medical training or do their postdoc time there. In fact, in a ranking of internationally of the academic affiliation of Nobel Prize winners in medicine and physiology, chemistry, for the decade up to the beginning of the Second World War in 1939, if there if you make such a ranking, then you will see that German and Austrian universities were at the top rank for Nobel Prize winners. And indeed, many prominent American physicians, including later Nobel Prize winners, had spent a period of their medical studies or postdoc years at German medical schools in the 1920s and 1930s. And up to World War II, they were very proud to point to this in public, in the US public, in the academic sphere. I have spent some years at Berlin or Vienna Medical School. So the fact that 12 of the 20 physician defendants at the Nuremberg medical trial were members of these most prestigious German university medical schools was a problem, not only for the German, but for the international medical community. Next slide, please. There's another aspect to the trial, namely that the expert witness Andrew Ivy, who had been delegated to the trial by the American Medical Association and who had been the president actually of the American Physiological Association previously, he was concerned at the beginning of the trial that the proceedings might, quote, stir up public opinion against the use of humans in any experimental manner whatsoever, so beyond Germany, so that a hindrance will therefore result to the progress of science in general. So there was an awareness on the side of Ivy and many other physicians at the time that for the public, also in view of the reputation of German medical science, there might not be a clear distinction between the experiments conducted in the Nazi context and those conducted, for instance, at the same time in the US. That could happen if people listen and are not prepared too much in detail and listen to the proceedings. So Ivy and others were very much interested in trying to draw a clear line between what physician medical scientists in the Nazi context had done, atrocious research, for instance, and what non-German medical sciences would do. And the same was true for an attempt, which was not very much extensively discussed at the trial, but the same problem occurred in regard to eugenic measures. Was there a difference? This was the question, between eugenics in the United States and eugenics, frequently called racial hygiene, in the German context. Where exactly was the difference? Further, the debates at the Nuremberg medical trial demonstrated that until then, when it was conducted, that is in 1946-47, there did not exist an explicit and internationally binding ethical and legal framework for human subject research. And finally, the trial documented that among the medical expert witnesses testifying during the trial, there was no consensus about what should be the exact content of a potential ethical framework. So, as you can see, it was not only about, the trial was not only about legal issues and questions of criminality, but it was also about matters of quality, if you want, of research and of ethical issues. Okay, so in parallel to the trial, there was a development leading to the establishment of the WMA. And there is a link between these two events. Since the early 1940s, there had been debates about internationally shared interests of the medical profession in various national contexts, and some of representatives of national groups of physicians gathered at various places, partly in London or in Paris, to discuss how their potential platform for the medical profession internationally might look like. And these debates and discussions converged into the establishment of the World Medical Association, WMA, in September 1947. That is exactly in parallel to the Nuremberg medical trial. It's actually 1 month after the conclusion of the trial, when the first General Assembly of the WMA met after a number of preparatory meetings of small groups. So in this first General Assembly, in view of experiences encountered at the parallel trial, one of the first points on the agenda and top points on the agenda of the WMA was establishing ethical guidelines for physicians internationally, because it was obvious that something like that didn't exist. And these kind of guidelines should have a double function, according to the representatives of the WMA. In face of the medical atrocities and the Nuremberg medical trials and concerns about the loss of trust in the medical profession, the one function of such guidelines should be a message to the international medical community, so that is into the medical community itself. A message, what are the basic ethical guidelines, principles guiding medical activity. And the second function was that it was a message, should be a message to the outside public, external to the profession, to show that the international medical community has ethical guidelines. And these are the guidelines, yeah? Here they are. So there were these two functions to the envisaged guidelines. And the idea was to very speedily formulate a pledge or oath with basic norms and ethical guidelines to be taken, for instance, at graduation or licensing ceremonies. And actually, the WMA succeeded in preparing such a basic pledge, namely the Declaration of Geneva, which probably all of you know. It was proclaimed at the Second Assembly of the WMA in 1948. In its first version, as you may know, it has been repeatedly updated, revised until very recently. I think the last revision is of 2017. So, this Declaration of Geneva is very interesting in view of its relation to the Nazi medical crimes and the Nuremberg medical trial. Actually, in form and in content, it was a direct response to the medical atrocities discussed at the Nuremberg trial. First of all, the speedy formulation of the pledge. The pledge should be sort of pushed out, shown to the public very quickly. And therefore, the committee drafting the pledge used as a blueprint the Hippocratic Oath, which enabled them to formulate the new pledge within only 1 year, after the idea about such a pledge had been brought up. And this is interesting, and it's the significance of this you will see if you look at the second basic document of the WMA, which is the Declaration of Helsinki, which is focused on medical research. And this document needed 17 years of preparation and heated and conflictuous negotiations until it was proclaimed in 1964 at the assembly held in Helsinki. And because the issues were quite controversial, and various national medical associations, in particular the American Medical Association, tried to take a strong influence on the specific content of that. So you can see that this only 1 year until the until the proclamation of the Declaration of Geneva was really an achievement, if you want. So this is one aspect which shows that there was a big pressure perceived by the WMA to show both internally to physicians and externally to the world public that there are basic ethical guidelines for the medical profession and what they are exactly. Well, regarding content, the declaration was in fact a secularized version of the Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic Oath is, if you read closely, is full of kind of religious language and allusions to gods and so on and so on. So all this was cleared. And also it was purged of anachronisms. Like there's a big passage in the Hippocratic Oath about the social organization and the teaching of healers, or what we today would call physicians. At that time in antiquity, in the time of Hippocrates, there were no physicians because there were no medical schools and so on and so on. Yeah, so all this was thrown out, and also the passages on outsider surgeons who are not proper healers or don't belong to the group of those who swear the oath. So this was one process to get rid of the anachronisms and of the religious language of the oath. And then there was an introduction of new, very characteristic elements, which are clearly a response to the Nuremberg medical trial and what had been discussed there. The first, and to my understanding, most important thing is that there was, they introduced an explicit value hierarchy into this Declaration of Geneva. And it is, you will see the impact of this or the importance of this if you compare it to the Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic Oath is a list of positive and negative norms. I shall do this, I shall not do this, I shall do this, I shall not do this. It's just a list without any hierarchy. But in the Declaration of Geneva, there is one top priority for any physician, and that's formulated in the sentence that the health of my patient will be my first consideration. And this is clearly an answer to what had become visible at the Nuremberg medical trial, that in the Nazi context, for instance, but not only there, but very sort of prominent, the health of the population was top priority of physicians and their work. And also, it's also a statement against another kind of hierarchy, namely that the production of new knowledge in medical research is top priority versus the well-being of the research subject. Yeah, this is a hierarchy. And here, in the context of the Declaration of Geneva, it's clear that the patient, or if you understand it a little bit more broadly, the research subject is the well-being of the research subject or the patient is top priority. Yeah, it's superordinated in comparison to the production of new medical knowledge. So this explicit value hierarchy and the introduction of this explicit hierarchy is a very significant difference to the Hippocratic Oath. And it is quite obviously a response to the Nuremberg medical trial. And another very, very important point is that the Declaration of Geneva prohibits discrimination. The relevant sentence is, quote, I will not permit consideration of religion, nationality, race, party politics, or social standing to intervene between my duty and my patient. And as you are aware, all these factors like religion, nationality, race, party politics, and so on played a big role in the context of medicine as it was practiced in the Nazi context. Actually, also perhaps in other contexts, but they are very, very clearly. So both these points, the explicit hierarchy and the prohibition of discrimination, are the central sort of new elements, I would argue, of the Declaration of Geneva in comparison to the Hippocratic Oath, which was the blueprint for the declaration. Well, so that's one point. That's one basic outcome in view of ethics from the Nuremberg medical trial and the experiences there and what was shown there about medicine during the Nazi period. A very different aspect related to the WMA that leads us also to the German medical profession is the attitude within the WMA immediately after its foundation or establishment towards the German medical community. The representatives of the German medical profession had not been invited by the organizing committee for the first General Assembly of the WMA in 1947. So there were no Germans, there were also no Japanese physicians. And at this first General Assembly in September 1947, the WMA delegates agreed on a declaration to be signed by representatives of the German medical profession as a prerequisite for membership in the WMA. And this declaration had two conditions. First, the representatives of the German profession should admit that German physicians had participated in many acts of cruelty, suppression, and atrocious experiments. And secondly, they should admit that in doing so, in participating in that, the German medical profession in general had, quote, violated the ethical tradition of medicine, disparaged the honor of the medical profession, and humiliated medical science in serving war and political hate. So these were the two conditions which the German medical profession should accept in order to be able to join the WMA. How did the German medical profession react to this demand by the WMA? And how actually did the medical profession react to the Nuremberg medical trial in general and everything else what had become public immediately after the war about Nazi medicine? Next one, please. So in order to understand what was going on there, first of all, let's really look in this small period of time between 1945 and 1948-49. So after Germany's defeat in 1945, Germany was divided in 4 zones, which were occupied and governed by the 4 allies, as you certainly know, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France. So Germany was fragmented in a way. And in summer 1946, there in the 3 Western zones, the medical profession established a kind of loose association, professional bodies, but which depended very much on support and agreement and some acceptance by the military governments. And in November 46, that is immediately before the start of the Nuremberg medical trial, there was the first meeting of these 3 Western professional bodies, which formed the so-called Working Group of West German Chambers of Physicians. The German abbreviation is AGWAK, Arbeitsgemeinschaft Westdeutscher Ärztekammern. And from 1955 onwards, this Arbeitsgemeinschaft, or this working group, changed its name and was called the German Medical Association, or Bundesärztekammer. So this Arbeitsgemeinschaft, or working group, is the predecessor of the German Medical Association. And they met, as I said, the first time in November 1946, a few weeks before the beginning of the Nuremberg medical trial. And the trial was the big sort of topic on the agenda of this meeting. There were heavy concerns about a further loss of trust in German physicians as a consequence of the trial. Because already, if you read the newspapers at the time, you could see, and also in letters to physicians and to government bodies and so on, that the German public had quite a problem with trust in German medicine and in German physicians after so many atrocities had become public within a few months after the end of the war. So, and the concern was that this big public trial would increase this problem of trust and reliability in German medicine and German physicians. So at this meeting, these professional bodies decided they would attempt to control, if possible, the media coverage on the Nuremberg medical trial by an officially delegated physician observer to the trial, who was to report on the proceedings, also in public and to the two physicians. And they also decided that they wanted to do everything possible to avert the idea, particularly in the public, that there might be a collective responsibility of the German medical profession. So they would accept, of course, that there were perpetrators, medical physicians who had been perpetrators, but they did not want, they wanted to avert the idea that there was kind of collective responsibility of the whole medical profession. Next one, please. And this working group appointed the neurologist Alexander Mitscherlich, who was a former member of the political resistance in the Nazi context. And they appointed him as head of an official commission of this working group to the Nuremberg medical trial. Mitscherlich followed, however, his own agenda of a transparent documentation of what had happened and what he heard at the trial. So he was not sort of complying actually with the expectations of this working group to give a very specific kind of purified, if you want, image of what had happened. But he wanted just to present the material which had been presented at the trial and discussed there. So he, within a few months, actually, he published the first preliminary documentation of the proceedings as a book. Already, it was published already in April 1947, so just 5 months after the beginning of the trial, when it was still going on. And he published that without prior consultation with this working group, the pre-German Medical Association, if you want. And the reaction in this working group was furious. Mitscherlich was heavily criticized because internal affairs of the profession had been made public and thereby contributed to further loss of trust in the profession. So that was the critique. And it was formulated in one of the next meetings where Mitscherlich was invited to the meetings of this group, but also in various other contexts, and he was attacked by professors from medical schools and so on. Mitscherlich, in contrast, held the position that also the non-professional public had a right to be fully informed about what had happened and what was discussed at the trial. And there should be no kind of medical censorship. Okay, so within the working group, this professional bodies, there were intense debates about withdrawing the mandate to Mitscherlich as an official observer at the trial. However, the situation changed completely in September 1947. So again, a few months later, when the working group of German physicians was confronted with the demand by the WMA to sign this declaration of responsibility. And they didn't want to accept this specific sort of formulation of the declaration as the WMA had passed it, because it contained actually an acceptance of the collective responsibility of the German Medical Association. That was what these representatives wanted to avoid. So immediately they changed their attitude to Mitscherlich and his documentation, because they realized that they could use that in public and also towards the WMA. Next slide, please. So how was it used? It was used, the documentation, in a twofold way by the working group, in the international arena and towards the WMA. So first of all, every official member of this working group, and also every other high-rank medic who traveled abroad to meet international colleagues at international conference, he got a copy of this documentation just to show that it was a proof that the German medical profession was prepared to look into the medical atrocities committed during the Nazi period, and the content of the documentation actually mentioned the names, numerous names of physicians who had committed the atrocities. And if you list all these names and count them, you could see that it's by no means the totality of the German medical community. It's quite a number, but it's not at all the whole community. So that was the argument, with the implying that the names mentioned there were exhaustive, that these were all the names of perpetrators. This was, of course, a very problematic assumption or implication. So for the working group, this was used as an argument that there is no collective guilt and no collective responsibility of the German medical profession as such. With this idea that the documentation of Mitscherlich could be used, they also supported a second, more extensive version of the documentation, which was published in 1949, and which had a new preface compared to the first version, claiming that 300 to 400 physicians were involved in the atrocities, out of 90,000 physicians working at the time in the Nazi context in Germany. So it is a number, but it is a comparatively small number, and it's not at all an indication that the whole medical profession was involved. And the second version was immediately after its publication sent to the WMA, and the WMA accepted the argumentation of the German physicians, and they had prepared another kind of declaration, which was not identical with the one originally drafted by the WMA. And this was accepted by the WMA, and they decided in 1950 that the German Medical Professional Association would be sort of allowed to join the WMA. So if you look at it from a bit more distance, it's quite interesting that in 1946-7, you had this Nuremberg medical trial, which really showed horrendous atrocities committed by German physicians. And it was very obvious that it's a huge problem for the German medical community. And they should not be just like that invited to join the WMA. And only 4 years later, they were a member of the WMA. Because of this kind of maneuvering and instrumentalization, if you want, of this documentation by Mitscherlich. So this is an example for me in a nutshell for the kind of ambivalence and limited openness, you want me to say, in view of the Nazi past by the working group, and that is by the later German Medical Association. Another interesting aspect is that this second version of the documentation was printed in 10,000 copies by the publisher, and all the 10,000 copies were purchased by the working group, and they had promised previously, before this went into print, to Mitscherlich, that these copies would be distributed amongst German physicians. Yeah? They bought it, and all of them should be distributed. But this didn't happen. they just make a short announcement in the what might be called the German Medical Journal, or its predecessor, that the copies were available on request. And it was a very, very short, small notice. And only very, very few copies of this book were actually ordered by individual physicians. So many thousands of these copies just stayed in the cellars of the working group and were disappeared after some time. So this is, I told you this sort of small anecdote, if you want, just to show you the kind of maneuvering and ambivalence and half-hearted mindedness of this professional body towards the Nazi past. And the main concern was not only loss of trust in German physicians, but also loss of trust and loss of reputation of the organization. Next one, please. Yeah, that's what I just said. These dealings around Mitchell's documentation in the late 1940s are just an exemplary case of what you can see in the next decades until the early 2000s, actually. If you look at it in a more general way, you can see three modes of response to the Nazi past. The first mode of response, if you want, is simply silence. And if you look at medical journals or other publications of physicians, in particular of the representatives of the German Medical Association, you don't find anything about the Nazi past of German medicine. Nothing. And actually, this silence didn't mean that it was openly suppressed to speak about that, but they just didn't speak about it, the representatives and the senior generation of physicians, and the younger generation didn't ask, because if they sort of showed some kind of interest in what had happened there, they were clearly, there was an indication that you shouldn't ask that. That's it. There was no policy of it was forbidden or something. It was no open censorship or something like that. Just nobody talked about this for about 30 years. And I remember that myself. I started with my medical studies in 1977, though at the end of this period, and nobody talked about that. But there were some kind of minor indications that there was a problem for me and some of my student colleagues. So we started looking, I started studying at the University of Heidelberg, and we tried to start looking into the history of the psychiatric department at the University of Heidelberg, which this attempt met with lots of difficulties, actually. This is a story, a separate story, but I just want to indicate that it was not possible to talk about that. But it was an implicit kind of agreement that one shouldn't talk about that. One should look ahead. Another strategy or mode of response was pointing to scapegoats. So if the topic came up in public because some kind of naive person asked, or if colleagues from abroad brought the topic up, then the strategy was to point to scapegoats. And this implied there were a few individual fanatic Nazi physicians who were responsible for what happened, but all the rest of the profession was not really involved. They were apolitical, and everything was pressed on them from the outside. So medicine and the medical profession in general was itself a victim of political or ideological pressure from outside, from the Nazis. And it was implicated that the Nazis are outside. There are no Nazis amongst the profession. Yeah, this was the implication. It was not explicitly said like that, but that was the implication. So there's a distinction. There's the realm of medicine, there's the realm of biomedical sciences. And if that was done properly, then it was not contaminated by politics, but political instances. The Nazis tried to infringe on pure kind of medicine. So these few fanatic Nazi physicians, they were the scapegoats who might be individually identified, put to trial, and sentenced, and that's solving the problem. There was no, the assumption was that there is no structural problem of medicine or German medicine in general. And a third mode of response, which only started to emerge in the 1980s, was a kind of critical self-reflection on the conditions in modern medicine prior to the Nazi period, which contributed to the manifestation of a widespread cooperation of physicians with the health policies of the regimes, and also to the fact that physicians themselves actually, in most cases, took the initiative for most of the medical atrocities. So if you look at it more closely, then it was already apparent actually in parts of the Nuremberg medical trial and contemporary first publications that most of the medical atrocities committed in the Nazi context were not pressed upon medicine from outside or initiated by political instances, but they were initiated by physicians themselves. And this is true for forced sterilization. This is true for the systematic killing of patients and mentally handicapped, so-called euthanasia program. And it's true for most cases of forced human subject research. Physicians took the initiative, physicians planned these acts, and they carried them through. Next one, please. So here are a few examples. For the mode of silence, as I said, nobody talked about this Nazi past of medical functionaries, for instance, and of medical institutions, and nobody asked. Yeah, this was a consensus, a silent and implicit consensus. So nobody talked about, for instance, this Karl Hedenkamp. He was one of the chief executive officers of the German Medical Association up till 1955. He was already fairly old then, and he died in 1956. So he was really one of the high-rank medical functionaries. But if you had looked at the time until 1945, you would have seen that he had been president of the Nazi Physicians Organization, the Nationalsozialistischer Deutscher Ärztebund, even before the rise to power of the Nazis in 1933. So he was already pre-1933, he was a medical functionary for the Nazis. And he was also a high medical functionary until 1945. He was a fervent anti-Semite, propagator of the forced sterilization programs, etc., etc. But nobody asked that. So he was, in a way, he was continuing in office as a representative of the profession until 1955. Another case would be Professor Ernst Fromm, who was the president of the German Medical Association from 1959 to 1973. Nobody talked about his past, but if you had looked at it, it would have been very obvious that until 1945, he was a member of the SA and of the SS, yeah, the most fervent Nazi fighters, if you want. So these are two examples where nobody was talking about. And two examples for scapegoats. Scapegoats were frequently those who were not anymore available after 1945 for legal persecution. Sorry. And one of the most prominent examples is Josef Mengele, the name you all know, who had done this atrocious research in the Auschwitz concentration camp, but he had disappeared in 1945. And later it was discovered that he apparently lived in South America in various Latin American states, where he also finally died. But he was not available, and he was one of the scapegoats. Yeah, he did this kind of research, and one or two other fanatic Nazis. And another similar case is Sigmund Rascher, who was a physician and SS member, who coordinator of the low pressure experiments in the concentration camp in Dachau. And he was actually a few weeks before the end of the war, he was executed by the SS itself because he had done something against the sort of internal rules of this organization. So he was not anymore available, and all the cases of death in these kind of experiments and so on were later blamed on him by those physicians who were, for instance, at the Nuremberg medical trial, physicians who were cooperating with him. But they said, well, we were not involved with the most serious kinds of experiments, but it was he who did it, and he was dead. Okay, so come very quickly to my conclusion. Next slide. I just want to mention one very striking and also exemplary case, and this is the case of Hans-Joachim Severing, who was president of the German Medical Association from 1973 to 1978. He was also quite a well-off person, and he later acted for some years as the treasurer for the WMA. And actually, in 1992, he was elected president-elect of the WMA. He should enter office in 1993. So this happened. So this shows also that the international medical community joined the strategy of silence. Yeah, they also didn't ask. They didn't want to know, because he was a very collegial guy. He organized the financial situation of the WMA. He was very constructive in his dealings in the WMA and so on. So they didn't ask about his past. But it was known, actually, since the 1970s, brought up by journalists, actually, that Severing had been a member of the SS, and that he had had responsibility as director of a hospital for tuberculosis patients for the transfer of children to a psychiatric asylum where these children were killed in the context of child euthanasia. So this was known, actually, from the 1970s. Severing himself denied, he accepted that, these children have been killed there. Well, that's very unfortunate, but I didn't know what happened to them after they had been transferred to this other hospital. So that was his strategy of defense. And when he was elected president-elect of the WMA, the public pressure grew, and there was a new investigation by the Catholic Church, which was actually running this tuberculosis hospital. And this investigation clarified that all the Catholic nurses in this hospital, directed by Severing, knew about the existence of the killing center and that the children would be killed after the transfer. So it was very implausible that Severing should not have known, as the head, the director of this hospital, whereas all the other staff knew about this. So when this became public, Severing stepped down as president of the WMA, just when he should start the office, the job. But he still refused to admit that he knew about this character of the killing center. And the WMA, and this is not about an individual, what I want to tell you, but the German Medical Association said in that context, well, all these accusations against Severing are old, never proven accusations. And it's actually a smear campaign in which the Jewish World Congress, that's what the German Medical Association said, that they had an important role in this smear campaign against Severing. So they still, in 1993, they did not accept, they went to the support of Severing instead of asking or organizing a full-fledged investigation. They just accepted his apologies and his explanations. And even in an official publication a few years later, in 1997, the official publication of the German Medical Association, it still said there is no substantial evidence for the assumption that Severin knew about the killings. So you can see that there is no transparent dealing with the past. There is no sort of open confrontation with that or full-scale investigation. So this was the situation until the early 2000s. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide. So this changed only in these early 2000s. And one of the triggers, the perhaps important moments in this development was a conference in 2008, a scholarly conference, first of all, on this topic, memories and representations of Nazi medicine in post-World War II medicine and bioethics. And on the last day of this conference, there were lots of media invited, national and international media, and also the representatives of the German Medical Association, the German Association of Psychiatrists, the German Association of Pediatricians, and other medical associations, in particular those who were most involved in the atrocities. They were invited to give a statement on the question, what does the Nazi past of medicine mean for medicine and medical ethics and for your organization today? So they were, in a way, confronted publicly with this question and also implicitly confronted with the fact that they had not looked at this past. So this initiated an internal self-reflection in these organizations. And from then onwards, you can see a process of starting investigations by these organizations in their own history and taking on the responsibility for the atrocities, all these in the form of apologies. And the first such apology was in 2010 by the German Association of Psychiatry. And they not only formulated this public apology to representatives of various victim groups, like victims of forced sterilization, victims of euthanasia, victims of human subject research, but they also staged a full-scale investigation with quite considerable or adequate funds into their own history. And they also organized a big exhibition which toured through Germany and also later on internationally. Okay, so that was the first event like that. And then in the same year, the German Association of Pediatrics also formulated a public apology, and took another 2 years until the German Medical Assembly, which is the parliament of the German Medical Association, also passed a declaration of responsibility of the responsibility of German physicians for medical atrocities. But significantly, in my perspective, they did not formulate apologies to any representatives of the victims, and they also did not, until today, initiate a full-scale investigation into their past. In 2015 followed an apology towards the Israeli Medical Association of the German Medical Association regarding the injustice done to Jewish colleagues. But there's only one victim group, you might argue, and I would argue. But there is no, until now, there are no apologies of the German Medical Association to victims of the systematic patient killings of euthanasia or to the victims of forced experiments. Okay, so that's what I wanted to give you as an input.